They're the world's most infamous serial killers.
It was the largest numbers of deaths attributable to a single mass murder in American history.
Here it was, all-American boys killing all-American girls.
But what drove them to commit their horrific crimes?
The victims had been cut open and their organs had been removed.
Was it nature?
Her father was reportedly a sex offender.
He's the most deranged fellow I ever met.
Or nurture?
The father stood and broke the mother's fingers one by one in front of the children.
Albert DeSalvo would go down in history as the Boston Strangler, confessing to the bizarre and brutal murders of 13 women.
She was left sitting up in bed with a broomstick shoved up into her vagina.
A crime wave that caused citywide terror.
Women would not let the postman or the milkman come to the door.
But was Albert DeSalvo a born killer?
No matter what he did, he wasn't violent about it or you know, hollering or screaming. He was very calm.
And was he even a killer at all? Albert DeSalvo was born in 1931 in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of Boston.
They lived in a housing project in Chelsea, Massachusetts, which was downtrodden, overcrowded, poor working conditions, poor people. Yet he was a pleasant enough child. Teachers in school said that he was a very personable little boy, that he would do errands for them and try to please them, as well as being a scamp.
One of 6 brothers and sisters, DeSalvo had a particularly hard upbringing.
Albert's father was an absolute brute. He used to bring prostitutes home and throw the mother out of the bedroom and engage with the prostitutes. He taught Albert how to break and enter when Albert was 5. He arranged for Albert to get initiated sexually when he was 7.
His father beat them. His father beat their mother. His father stood and broke the mother's fingers one by one by bending them backward until they broke in front of the children.
Albert's younger brother, Richard, who maintains Albert's innocence, recalls their tough childhood.
My dad, he drank. And when he drank, he was violent. I remember I had to be no more than 4, 5 at the very most. And there was a ruckus going on out in the kitchen. My mother had just got slammed and knocked down and hit the washing machine. And I think she ended up getting a split head or something. Albert was trying to defend her, and my dad had him by the throat. He had him with 2 hands around his neck. I recall this. He picked him up by his neck. I jumped up on the table. I remember climbing on the chair and climbing on the table. I don't know what I had in my hand, a spoon, a fork, a knife, something. And I trying to stick it in him, and I'm saying, leave my brother alone, leave my brother alone. I was screaming. I get whacked and knocked down.
We know that DeSalvo's father was very abusive towards DeSalvo's mother. And therefore, what that does for a child growing up is, firstly, give them a warped view of what masculinity is, and also give them a warped view about who women are and how to treat women.
I recall myself many, many times underneath the bed and as close to the other wall as possible whenever I heard my dad come in.
We are dealing with almost classic examples of a child being socialized into male violence.
Two of the basic drives for any human being is sex and aggression. And what development has to do is to separate those and put them into manageable places. And if you are an infant and you don't have a separation individuation, which implies boundaries in other areas, sex and aggression become fused. They become one and the same thing.
Albert's father, Frank, was in constant trouble with the law. In 1943, after committing a number of petty crimes, young Albert followed in his footsteps.
He and one or two other young boys had a German Luger. It wasn't a real German Luger. He and somebody else tried to hold up a cleaners with this type of gun. And that's what the first time I think he got in trouble, and they sent him to like what they call lineman school for boys.
All of the supposed reform schools or residential schools had continued violence. They were not nice places.
Well, Albert was away for quite a while at his young age. You had to take care of yourself. And if you didn't watch out for yourself, you know, who knows what could have happened.
He would have learned that if you're going to be threatened, you must be able to take care of yourself, either through physical action or by virtue of intellectual action, finding a way to be smarter than your tormentors. For him, it seemed that his modeling occurred in the family and was reinforced at Lyman.
In 1948, the street-smart 17-year-old joined the army and was sent to Germany, where military life appeared to agree with him.
There, he really found himself. He was always a hard worker.
He also boxed in Germany. He won a few fights. Now, of course, boxing, you lose them too sometime. But yeah, he did. He was a good fighter.
But post-war Germany offered other opportunities for DeSalvo. The fast-talking, good-looking young soldier had developed a voracious appetite for sex.
He is thought to have had intercourse with 2,000 women in Germany when he was stationed there as a military policeman. And it is thought that not too many of them complained.
He was oversexed. He spoke of masturbating many times a day, of being insatiable in his desires for sexual intercourse.
Whilst in Germany, DeSalvo met and married local girl Irmgard Beck. But on their return to Fort Dix in New Jersey, Albert fell foul of the law again. And this time, the crime was no mere robbery. James Logan, a defense attorney at the time, got the case.
I was practicing law in Mount Holly, mainly criminal law, and I did a lot of work for various service people, mostly Fort Dix. He came to the office, we signed him up as a client. He was charged with debauching the morals of a minor.
DeSalvo was accused of sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl after entering her home, posing as a rent collector.
He seemed like a pretty ordinary guy, nothing particular about him. I didn't think he was particularly flamboyant, he was sort of dull. He just denied it happened, and his position was he's pleading not guilty, going to fight it out.
24-year-old Albert DeSalvo was held at the Burlington County Jail before trial. He faced up to 5 years in prison if convicted. But then he got a break.
Rather than go through the trial, the child's mother decided that She didn't want her daughter to testify because of possible embarrassment and rehashing of the incident, so the case was dismissed. Lucky for him, I suppose, they decided to back off.
DeSalvo was discharged from the army and returned to Boston with his wife to start a family. Getting a series of manual jobs, he slipped effortlessly back into his old community.
He was popular, I would say, most places he went because he always had a smile. He was very well liked by a lot of people. He mingled very easily.
But the gregarious family man was far from a pillar of society.
He was a B&E specialist, breaking and entering. He has alleged that he was in every single apartment on Charles Street, which is one of the finer sections of the city of Boston. He would go up fire escapes. He was simply very, very adept at getting in and out of buildings.
Albert DeSalvo, however, would soon be entering Boston's apartment blocks with a much more sinister mission in mind. Boston, 1960. Albert DeSalvo has already been arrested several times for breaking and entering and for the alleged assault of a 9-year-old girl. Now his voracious sexual appetite would see him embark on a peculiar new crime spree. DeSalvo's tough upbringing and his time in reform school and the army had left him with the skills of a master conman.
He started out knocking on the doors of women and telling them that he was from a modeling agency and that they were looking for a certain kind of model who looked like the woman, whatever she looked like, who answered the door.
He would ask that she don a leotard so that he could take her measurements, which were, in those days, very much a part of the hoorah, suggesting an attractive woman, 36, 24, 37. And lo and behold, most of these women did. He wound up having sex with many of them. Some were unhappy and complained, some were not.
It was a more naive time, I think. Money was not abundant. I mean, if someone knocked on your door and said, you could make $40 an hour if you just let us take a few photographs, if your measurements are right.
With no modeling contracts forthcoming, women began to report the bizarre sexual assaults. The police dubbed the phantom agent the measuring man.
It's a very clever way to capture the interest of people, all of whom at some time think that they're capable of being a model. It tends to change their judgment. They tend to lose a capacity to judge. They tend to lose the capacity for, oh, this doesn't seem right. Why am I doing this? It goes out the window when somebody taps into that aspiration. And that's what a good con man does.
In 1961, Albert DeSalvo was arrested for breaking and entering. While in custody, he confessed that he was the measuring man. DeSalvo was diagnosed a sociopath and sent to prison. Then, soon after his release, 11 months later, there began a series of attacks that would shock the city of Boston to its core.
It was the summer of 1962. It was June, weather was fine, and we had a murder of a woman in the Back Bay. A woman in her 50s, Anna Slessors.
Loretta McLaughlin, a young reporter, was intrigued.
The story, I believe, appeared on page 14. It was just a few paragraphs, woman slain in Back Bay.
Anna Slessors, a 55-year-old divorcee living on her own, was discovered lying dead, naked on the floor near her bathroom. A cord from her blue housecoat had been tied tightly around her throat, fashioned in a bow. "68-year-old Nina Nichols' body was discovered with her own nylon stockings knotted around her neck, her legs spread, and her housecoat pulled up to her waist. She'd been sexually assaulted with a wine bottle.
And then a third woman in July. But she wasn't in Boston. She was up on the North Shore.
65-year-old Helen Blake had also been strangled with a nylon stocking. She lay face down on her bed, legs apart, naked from the waist down. Again, she'd been sexually assaulted.
It became obvious that these women were strangled, that there were sort of decorative bows tied around their necks. It really began to drift like a fog over the city that we had a killer loose in Boston. Why is someone going around strangling nobody women who no basis, no reason whatsoever? They're elderly, you know, they're not young sex queens. Why is this happening? And then the fourth woman, Ida Erger, she was a very elderly woman.
The quiet, inoffensive 75-year-old divorcee had been strangled with a pillowcase, knotted tightly around her neck.
He actually hooked her heels up in the rungs of chairs in a gynecological position that women would be familiar with, having gynecological exams.
The bizarre display would be seen immediately on entering the apartment.
It's very clear that the murderer is proud of his activity. He makes no effort, for example, to leave these women in places where they can retain their dignity. He's going to display their sexual organs. He's going to leave them in places whereby those people who will encounter those dead bodies will talk about how marked an impact it had had on them.
Look at me. Look what I have done. Look how wonderfully I've been able to show you, to shock you. I am a powerful person who is capable of doing these things and not being found.
She would be positioned so that her nakedness and her genitalia and so forth would be staring you right in the face most of the time. And of course, he not only strangled them, he molested them sexually, terribly.
The city of Boston began to panic. In just over 2 months, 4 elderly ladies had been brutally murdered.
Everybody in Boston was painfully aware of the stranglings and beyond the city itself.
Big news. Down here as well. It was a big-time event.
Women would not let the postman or the milkman come to the door. They certainly wouldn't let him in.
The animal rescue places were absolutely depleted of dogs. Pet stops, they couldn't keep enough dogs. Everyone got guns, weapons, locks on houses, alarm systems. There was a genuine terror in the city.
A number of these victims are very elderly. The elderly are often isolated, voiceless, powerlessness. The elderly are often more trusting.
The Boston Strangler never broke down a door. He somehow managed to get himself welcomed, at least over the threshold.
Most serial killers are very charming people on the surface, and you never suspect that they have any type of deep interior rageful life.
The day after Ida Erger's murder, and the decomposing body of 67-year-old Jane Sullivan is discovered. She had been strangled with her own stockings. In the space of 10 weeks, the mystery killer had claimed the lives of 5 elderly women. But the Boston Strangler's reign was far from over, and it was about to take a new twist that would leave the city paralyzed with fear. In 1962, the city of Boston was gripped with fear. 5 harmless elderly women had been sexually assaulted and strangled in their own apartments. With no signs of forced entry, it seemed each had willingly allowed their murderer in. Police raced to identify the killer, who reporter Loretta McLaughlin had dubbed the Boston Strangler.
The police were not standing still at all while the stranglings were going on. And one suspect after another sort of came into focus.
There were 5 police departments, 3 different district attorneys who had investigators. Each jurisdiction had their own view of the case.
Beat officer Steve Delaney had developed his own suspect.
I started investigating a fellow who's working in Boston as a dishwasher, a middle-aged man, and he's a mental patient. And he says he's done terrible things. And he was a mother hater. And part of the themes were he either hates medicine, nurses, mother, or all of the above.
Delaney's suspect may have fit the profile, but he was innocent. Soon, every oddball and sex offender in the city was put under the microscope. But while hundreds of men were investigated, one was completely ignored. Albert DeSalvo, a hard-working, smart-talking, family man.
When he worked with me in the shipyard, I don't know if it had to do with the fact he was in the service for that many years or not, but he got along so good with all the sailors that he used to work out some deals with them and swap things for them and you know, get stuff. And he was always hustling.
But not everything in DeSalvo's life was going well. He'd always been highly sexed, and his relationship with his wife was suffering.
There were certain things that she refused to do with him in the bedroom, which is fine, you know. But she also used her sex to punish him. When he got in trouble, or if she didn't get something she wanted or whatever, and he wanted to have sex, she'd turn around, she wouldn't give him, you know, she'd say no. And it was done in such a way as she was actually using it to get what she wanted.
Meanwhile, the search for the Boston Strangler continued. On a wet and windy day in early December 1962, the pattern of the murders changed. 21-year-old Sophie Clark sat down to begin writing a letter. She was alone in her apartment when there was a knock at the door. The letter was never finished. Sophie Clark was discovered by her flatmates, strangled, with 3 of her own nylon stockings tied tightly in a bow around her neck. Her naked body lay on the floor with her legs spread apart. She had been sexually assaulted.
She was a black girl, a student, I lived on Huntington Avenue, again on the outskirts of the Back Bay. There were no clues. He made no mistakes.
Serial murderers don't do the same thing all the time. They try different methods of killing people. They try different displays. They try different types of catching a victim. So they're very difficult to catch. Serial killers don't really have patterns. They may for a while, and then they'll try to find something else.
With just 2 days of 1962 remaining, 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was spotted in the laundry room of her apartment block, cheerily humming. On New Year's Eve, Patricia became the 7th victim of the Boston Strangler.
She had the bedclothes pulled right up to her neck. She had been sodomized as well as raped.
Months went by before the Strangler struck again. May 1963, and 23-year-old Beverly Saymons had failed to turn up for choir practice. A concerned friend entered Beverly's apartment. Directly in front of him lay her body. She had been stabbed 22 times, 4 in the throat and 18 times in her left breast, in the pattern of a bullseye. 2 handkerchiefs were knotted around her neck. Months passed, and 2 more women would die at the hands of the Strangler.
It went on for about 18 months. 10 dead women that we considered related, and I think the police did too at this point. They certainly knew they had a psychopath on their hands.
On January the 4th, 1964, Patricia Elmore and Pamela Parker arrived home to the apartment they shared with their friendly, music-loving roommate, Mary Sullivan.
She was only 19 years old, and she was the typical young, slender, good-looking, the girl every guy would be interested in dating.
Once inside the apartment, what they saw would never leave them.
She was left sitting up in bed with her legs splayed and with a broomstick shoved up into her vagina.
Then the strangling suddenly stopped.
Months went by. There were no more stranglings. There was all kinds of speculation. Had he died? Had he been arrested? Had he moved out of the state? Was he in another country?
We have had cases where a serial killer will go to a certain point and then stop, and we don't know why. It's very rare, though, because usually when a serial murder begins their work, they don't stop until somebody stops them.
Faced with almost a dozen unsolved murders, the state's Attorney General formed a dedicated Strangler Bureau. Officer Steve Delaney was one of those tasked with making sense of the crimes.
I get a wall and I take all the crime scene photos. If you took any group of civilians in and let them study them, they would come over and pick the elderly ladies and say, definitely the same crime, same MO. And someone else would pick the younger ones and say the same crime.
The bizarre sequence of murders had everyone baffled. Then the police became embroiled in a new crime wave. They had a serial rapist loose on the streets.
It is said that only 1 in 60 rapes was ever reported at the time, and yet here was a series of women coming in saying they had been raped, and they had been raped in a very spectacular way. He would tie them up. He would tie their hands up to the headpost and feet to the footboards, and he would rape them.
The rapist, wearing green workman's clothes, became known as the Green Man.
A man would appear at the foot of the bed, already in the house. And he talked to them, and he told them he was not going to really harm them, although he sometimes had a knife.
In 1964, a sketch of the attacker was created. Detectives recognized him as the former measuring man, Albert DeSalvo.
He was arrested, and he was sent to the Bridgewater. At that time, it was called the State Hospital for the Criminally Insane.
Police estimated that DeSalvo, as the Green Man, may have committed hundreds of assaults. Richard DeSalvo, however, is convinced that his brother was not a vicious man.
No matter what he did, he wasn't violent about it or you know, hollering or screaming. He was very calm. One woman said after he had tied him up, taped them all up, or whatever he did, he was ready to leave, and the woman said, you know, this is awful, I ain't gonna be able to get it. He went right back in and loosened up the bounds on her, or whatever it was, loosened them up, and then he went away.
DeSalvo revealed quite a lot of information about himself as a rapist during the Green Man rapes, because it's quite clear that he was a power reassurance rapist. This was a man who was raping and then fondling and kissing and apologizing to his victims, and therefore seeking reassurance, because he's trying to form some form of inappropriate relationship with his victim, because he wants to be reassured about his own masculinity. He wants to be reassured about his own sexual performance.
DeSalvo was interred at the Bridgewater State Hospital for the Criminally Insane until he was considered fit to stand trial. There, he would make a staggering claim. In 1965, the city of Boston had been rocked by the murder of 11 women, all victim to the mysterious Boston Strangler. Albert DeSalvo is held at the Bridgewater State Hospital, believed to be guilty of up to 300 sexual assaults. Whilst awaiting trial for his so-called Green Man crimes, DeSalvo makes an astonishing claim. He is the Boston Strangler. Renowned lawyer F. Lee Bailey received word DeSalvo wanted to speak to him. At first, he was skeptical.
When serial killings are going on and widely publicized, there is a tendency for people to come forward and confess. And the police have to sort these out. But here's a fellow already in a mental institution, which suggests some degree of unbalanced self-aggrandizement, all kinds of things. In that when I met him, he was absolutely nothing like I expected. He began to have the ring of truth almost from the second or third sentence. I had armed myself with a few questions. I was quite friendly with those in Boston homicide because I did homicide cases. And I said, could you give me a few questions to which only a cop would know the answer, but not the press? And I won't know whether the answers are good, but I'll bring them back to you. And I could tell when I read the answers to them that something had touched a hot spot.
Bailey arranged for DeSalvo to be interviewed by the well-known hypnotherapist, Dr. William Bryan. When Officer Steve Delaney of the Strangler Bureau heard the confession, he was sure that DeSalvo was their man.
If the public could have heard this tape of Albert DeSalvo in a semi-hypnotic state, supposedly, he was given the details, and they were pretty convincing and pretty frightening.
DeSalvo's recollection of the Beverly Saymans murder gave Officer Delaney a chilling insight into the possible motives for the killings.
He got the sex urge, and he got into Beverly Saymans' apartment, and when she woke up, she was giving him an argument. She had extracted a promise from him not to have intercourse. He agreed. Lip service. So now he had her hands tied, her feet tied, and she's down on the bed, and he says he wasn't going to mount her. He was just changing his position. But she started screaming and twisting, and the gag got loose, and she started yelling, "You promised, you promised, you promised." He's on this bed with Dr. Bryant, and you could hear his fist pounding on the bed. Had to shut her up, had to shut her up, had to shut her up. And he screams, "Just like my wife." You know, it's a piercing scream. It ran chills up and down just hearing it. But this is what was going through his mind. When somebody said no, somebody rejected him, it was his wife all over again.
DeSalvo would be questioned repeatedly by law enforcement.
They would take him through crime by crime and have him describe exactly what had happened. And this went on for a number of days. And DeSalvo could describe each apartment. He drew a picture of some of the apartments. He described carvings on a headboard. He could tell you what a woman had had on her bureau or what was in a bureau drawer.
Crucially, he confessed to a killing that had never been reported, claiming an elderly woman had died in his arms of fright around the time of the first strangling. His confession checked out.
He laid out chapter and verse, things that we thought only the killer could have known.
DeSalvo also had an explanation for how he'd gained entry, even at the height of the hysteria.
He would come to an apartment and knock on the door. If the lady who opened it was to his liking and her physical beauty and age had nothing to do with it, if she was to his liking, he would report that the landlord had sent him up because the contract showed that she was entitled to a new refrigerator. And she would have some choice in the make and color. And people who were scared to death of the Boston Strangler suddenly began thinking of that new refrigerator. And in he came. It could be a paint job for the apartment. It could be anything that was a benefit and unexpected. And if they hesitated, he said, "That's okay. It's not necessary if you don't want it," and would start out the door. And at that point, they figured, well, this guy's not the Strangler. He would have hit me by now. So come on back.
But there was no physical evidence linking DeSalvo to the crimes, and defense lawyer Bailey had secured a commitment that the confessions could not be used against him in court. In 1967, DeSalvo was found guilty on 10 counts of indecent assault and armed robbery, and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was never tried or charged with any of the stranglings. Richard DeSalvo is convinced his brother is innocent of all the murders, believing he was enticed to confess by the possibility of lucrative rewards and book and movie deals.
I think Albert confessed solely had to do with money. There was I think it was $10,000 reward for the capture or anybody that knew who the Boston Strangler was. I absolutely believe that's why he did it.
Richard describes his brother as a con man who got conned. He states that during a phone conversation in November 1973, his brother said he had something explosive to tell the world.
He spoke to me. He says, heads are gonna roll when this comes out. He said, there'll be red faces and heads are gonna roll. But see, he said it while he was in the prison. And you'd think he would have knew and realized anything you talk on those phones, they got it. Whoever you talk to, whatever you say, they got it. They got it right there themselves. So that's all they were waiting for, as far as I believe. Albert made the mistake.
No one would find out what DeSalvo's important announcement was.
That next morning, he was dead. I got a call. He was murdered. It says, Albert is deceased. And I went to say something, they hanged up on me. I had to call back. I called back and I asked this, what's going on? What are you saying? And he said, Albert's deceased, hanged up again. Wouldn't talk to me.
Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his locked cell. No one was ever convicted of his murder. So was Albert DeSalvo a born killer, a product of his environment, or a misguided hustler, innocent of the most famous crime spree in Boston's history? After more than 40 years, opinion is still divided.
I think the jury's out for me about some of these murders, but I have no doubt that Albert DeSalvo was a serial killer. Socialization is a very powerful phenomenon. In the right circumstances, people can be socialized into behaving in the most extraordinary way towards their fellow human beings. This boy, socialized for a number of years in that kind of abusive environment, would begin to see that kind of abuse as normal, as almost as desirable.
The killer, I am convinced, was Albert DeSalvo, no question. If you wanted to say that, someone could have been training to become the Boston Strangler, it was Albert DeSalvo.
I'm not sure he ever killed anybody. The physical evidence that we have today suggests or cannot make any connections with him and the killers. He's disturbed enough that he wants to take on that persona and that infamy, because there is status that comes with doing horrendous, horrible things.
I do think he was. I do not think he was responsible for all the crimes that have been ascribed to him. There are copycats out there, but in Albert DeSalvo's case, I think there's irrefutable proof that he was born to be a killer. He grew up in a family where the other members didn't kill anyone and saw the same things. There was no history of murders within the family. There was no indication that he was anything other than a terrible, horrible mutation of a human being.
His background enough was basis to suggest that he was eminently capable of wiping out human life without much remorse. Is this monster basically a genetic evolution, genes handed down from his parents that committed him to be violent and cruel? Or is he a product of his environment? Albert's father was such, so there certainly could have been a gene there, a bad seed. But Albert's background was enough to have taken an angel and made him into a psychopath, just to survive.